here. Today we will be shading our still life from start to finish, step by step together. I'm excited you can join me. If you have not already done the sketch, go back to lesson 1 and do the sketch along with me. And also, I have a shading technique video that will help you have some different ideas on how to approach this shading instruction. So I suggest you do those 2 videos before this one. That being said, let's get started. Our memory verse for this lesson is found in John 3:19, and this is the judgment. The light has come into the world, and people loved the darkness rather than light, because their works were evil. Let's pray. Lord, I just ask that you would bless this lesson, that you'd help us to understand who you are. I pray for everyone watching and everyone doing the lesson with me, that they would have a saving knowledge of you, Lord, and that they would desire to use their artistic skills to honor you. And I do pray, Lord, that you would teach us that we should love the light, and that you would give us your spirit so that we will love your light and your truth that's found in your word. Help my teaching, help my instruction. I pray over this whole lesson that it would be a blessing to all those who watch. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Okay, we're going to gather supplies and get started. So for today's lesson, you'll need an eraser, tissue, drawing pencils, optionally a blending stick, and paper or a sketchbook. You will also need for this setup the image printed out in black and white and in color if you possibly can. The link to download this image and print it out is below in the description, so feel free to do that. I also have a link to download this sketch if you didn't have time to do the sketch with us and you just want to practice shading it. I do have a prepared sketch that you can download. The first thing we're going to do is clean the area, your tabletop. You don't want anything underneath your drawing while you're doing this work. And then take a look at the drawing. You know, this is what it should have looked like if you did the sketching exercise with me. This is our finished sketch. Notice all the measurement lines I have floating around here. Those are going to interrupt what I'd like to do with the final look. So at this point, I'm going to clean up the drawing. I'm getting rid of extra measurement lines that are kind of a little too dark. Any lines that look a little out of place, I'm going to correct. At this point, it's really a good time to just take a look at your drawing and say, is it right? Is it accurate? One tip I have for you is to put it in a mirror and look at it in the mirror and say, the mirror perspective is really going to show you if you're right or not. So go ahead and just clean up the drawing and make sure all your lines are accurate and make sure your proportions look good. And you're always comparing it to your still life. So looking at the still life, looking at your drawing, making sure everything's accurate and correct. Also making sure your lines aren't too dark, because we want to be able to shade on top of these lines without seeing the lines when we're done. So double check that, and when you're done, you should have your finished still life sketch there. Okay, so you should have the finished sketch, and we're going to put a piece of paper behind it just so you can test the smoothness of your blending before you apply the blending. The very first thing we're going to do is get your 2H pencil, and you are going to start marking all of your shadow lines for this sketch. Keep looking at your still life, pay attention to where everything's lining up, and use the principles that we worked through for lesson 1. You want to make sure that you're thinking in terms of measurements, you're comparing where things are, and get your eye more trained so you can do a better job executing an accurate sketch. You know, I'll admit this is not my favorite part of the drawing. I do not enjoy doing the measurements and thinking. It just feels dry and slow and tedious. But it really is important if you want a successful end game. One technique I like is to squint at the still life. It blurs the shadows and gives you a clear picture of what the shadow tones are, and it's less confusing. So before you start shading, we're going to squint at it. Okay, so now we can get started with the fun part. And so with your HB pencil, you are going to shade on top of the line that's going that line that you made across the sphere. I want you to shade down right on top of that the way I did. And I'm making some additional marks to just remind myself that there's going to be reflective shadow. This sphere is a little tougher to shade because of all that reflective shadow you're getting. But if you just pay attention to the shape of all of the tones, that's what's going to make a difference. It's really just about the shapes that are in that form. And so here I am using a little bit more pressure on the HB. I also lightened the pressure to get that lighter shaded area there. And I'm adding a little bit more pressure down here for the shadow. What's really important is that you work the whole drawing together. So notice I'm not grabbing my 2B, my 8B pencils for the sphere and finishing off the sphere before I get to the cube. I'm going to work along the shadow direction all the way around, and I'm going to work around the drawing kind of like I'm going counterclockwise here, but I'm going to work around the drawing counterclockwise to try to make sure that I'm keeping it consistent. And so it is important to do this together. Notice as I'm laying these shadow tones down, I am making my shading marks go along the plane because of the technique I'm using here. I'm choosing to use a combination of scrubbing and hatching techniques. Again, check out the video on shading techniques if you're confused about what I mean. But I need to go along the plane because of the style of shading I'm doing. It really helps to not be going against the plane. So I'm going to be going along with the form. And this cone I really found a little tough because of where the shadow line is. It's just a little bit awkward. You just have to work with it and really pay attention to where it gets dark. It's a little not, it's not intuitive. And so I had to take some time to really think about where is the line and where is it gradiated. Again, there are areas that are very light, like the top of this cube. It is so light, but it does have a tone. And so you need to make sure that you pay attention to that as well. Now notice I left off that really dark edge of the cube. HB isn't going to do anything for that. So I'm waiting to get to my darker B pencils before I hit that with the tone. I don't want to, this is a smoother paper that I'm using in this. Because this is a beginner study, I didn't grab the heavier or more expensive drawing paper. So the tooth of the paper will kind of fill up quickly and you won't be able to lay more tone on top of it. Right here, what we're going to do is grab the 2B pencil and go ahead and start adding some heavier line weight to those shadow edges. The thing I like about adding this line weight is it really pops your drawing. It gives you clear boundary. It pops the drawing, it makes it stand out. But you have to be careful, as we discussed in the shading technique video, you do not want a hard line around the whole drawing. That will flatten the drawing. It'll keep it from reading as a three-dimensional shape, because in real life we don't see lines around objects. And so you want to make sure that your line is only where there's actually a shadow edge right there. And that's really going to help bring the drawing off of the surface of the paper. Again, one other thing I didn't mention is I'm using a piece of paper under my hand so that my hand doesn't smear. And I highly recommend you do that. This is, once you start laying down this 2B pencil, the B pencils smear pretty easily. So once you start getting into your B pencils, you just are going to want to have a something there, a piece of paper under your hand. So now with the 2B pencil, um, again, I'm just, after doing that contouring, I'm now going to go into the shadow and deepen these shadows using the 2B pencil. Like we discussed a little bit with our shading techniques, you know, the B pencils, the deeper you get, the softer they are, and so they're adding like a deeper tone that doesn't reflect the light. And so one key in really getting darker is you don't want to press real hard with the HB or the 2H because it's just going to be really shiny. But with this pencil, it's getting darker, and you're able to see the depth of the tone because it's not reflecting the light so much. So right here, the goal really was shading this. It can get confusing when you're looking at the shaded section of the image. You're just thinking, man, there's so many tones. How do I hit those tones? It's really important to generalize and remember how we squinted. Keep squinting. Keep looking at your black and white printout also, because that's not going to have so many variations. And it'll help you generalize because you always work very general to specific. And that's how layering general to specific is how you're going to get very detailed and very realistic. These reflective shadows can be a pain, but just again, look at the shape of the shadow and just shade it in the shape that you're seeing. Here, along this shadow here along the cube, one thing I noticed is right at the edge, it has a really nice light lit edge right there behind the shadow. And so I'll show you a trick we're going to do later to make sure we accomplish that. Also, shadows are not flat. They have layers to them, as you see. And so we're going to make sure that we incorporate the layers. Now, this is one of my favorite parts of the drawing, is getting this edge really dark. The key is you want, as you're filling this in, you want the edges along the side of the cube to stay pretty straight. And it can be really tough to be shading this in and not accidentally go over the edge. So what I recommend doing is just putting a little bit of shading on the edge and do the broad shading in the middle, kind of like you're just filling it in. I also like to go from the top down. I find that easier, but you do the method that works for you. Like we learned in the sketching video, I also always turn the page. I'm more comfortable working that way. I like to turn the page as I go to make sure that I'm getting those straighter edges right. But even if you're turning the page, you have to make sure that you're looking at your still life at all times, that you're not just doing it in your head, that you're making sure what you're doing is matching what the still life is suggesting you need to do. And I'm not going super deep with this 2B because I know I'm going to have to get to the 8B tone on that side with that cube. So we're going to also add some of the shading to this cone. And the key here, again, I told you this section was a little bit challenging because of where the deep shading is. It's just a little, it's not what you expect. And so I focused on that heavy shade and is at the top of this cone. And then you need to kind of pull that down. And as you're going down, you're always thinking about your pencil pressure. Is this a section that it needs to be lighter? If I have the 2B pencil, but I'm going in a lighter section, I'm lightening the pressure so it gets lighter. So now I'm grabbing the 4B pencil. And again, as the pencils get softer in value, you do want to make sure that your edge is really smooth and right, so you're getting the right spread, the right shading coverage on it. And with the 4B pencil, I'm really focusing on my darker darks. So what I'm going to do, as you can see, I'm going over this 2B shading that I did, and I'm really sticking kind of pretty closely to the 2B shading, and I'm just going over it and using a little bit more pressure where I see, especially on the sphere in that center line of shadow is pretty dark. And then directly under, again, keep squinting to see what values are darker and what values are lighter. Um, and that can be helpful to you also. So another thing that I think is important is you're going to start using the eraser a little bit more as you do this to make sure your edges are pretty high contrast. And if you'll notice, one thing I'm really watching is the the lights and darks on the edge of the form. I really want a high contrast here with this cube right on that edge. I want it to pop. And so I'm focusing on making sure that as I'm shading, I'm getting my darkest dark right there by the lightest light, right there where it's just bathed in light, right on that corner. It needs to be sharp and very dark. So you want to make sure that you're getting that degree of dark right there. And we will work our way down to the HB. Um, that's our deepest dark. But with this 4B pencil, you really are going to get a lot of good gradation. And I like the 4B. I think it does really well. It's soft enough to get really, really dark, but it's still hard enough to not be falling apart as you're shading. Um, and it doesn't have so much spread where it's like a little too hard to keep it clean. So keep going, paying attention again also to the edge of this cube here. This is another area where you really want to watch your edges. Remember I said that there's a little section right here where it's just the light just catches that corner right there by the shadow. And that was an area I really wanted to pay attention to. It's a tricky area to capture. Um, I think to get it really, really detailed, I would need a finer eraser. But for this, what I ended up doing is just making sure that that shadow behind it, that's how you get it to look like it's really bathed in light, is to deepen and get your gray scale walking down so that you have that light value. Even the shadow on the form here, I'm making sure it's gradated. I want everything to have a gradient. I want those shadows that are on the surface to have a gradient as well. And I'm making sure this edge, I'm hitting this with a little bit more depth on that sphere so that the light that's coming behind the sphere can really show. So that's the 4B pencil, and I'm using the brush. Again, I like to use a brush to clear away any of the eraser pieces. It's better than using your hand because at this point everything's going to smear. So I recommend having a brush for that. You could also use the tissue that you have, that would work too. So now we're getting the 8B pencil, and this is going to be the deepest we're going to go. And you could go deeper on this drawing, but since this is just a beginner shading exercise, I really want to just teach you the different tones of the depth that you can get without it feeling overwhelming. 8B gets really dark. It's a great pencil, and I think it's really going to pop this this edge here. And also, if you squint at your image and you squint at your shading at this point, you should see it really starting to work. And that's where you want to make the adjustments as you go. Right now I'm just going over the 4B section but not filling in the 4B. I'm really just filling in the darkest darks at this point. I like the coverage the 8B can give me, especially if I want to gradiate it, and it blends really well, as you'll see at the end. I think it's a good pencil. So just keep working it with the eraser to make sure that your edge is not getting too, it's not filling in all the lights too much. But even on the lighter side, there is some tone. And so we want to make sure that will read properly. At this point, you see, I was just getting ready to do this backdrop, and I needed to make sure that the edge of the pencil is right. And so that's all that you're seeing there as I'm practicing with the edge of the pencil, just to make sure I can kind of gradiate this. And I picked the HB back up just to come back through and do a lighter, to look at my light shadows. So now we're going to add the edge of the table here, the surface that the still life is on. Pay attention, it's a little curved on the right side. And then after you add that, we're using the HB pencil for this. You're going to add a tone in the background to help bring these objects forward and also to brighten the lights. So when we're working on white paper, it's really important to add a tone in the background so that way your whites on the form really pop. On the side that's bathed in light, I'm going to add a deeper tone than I will add on the side that's dark, because you want your edge contrast to be clear. So I want to have a stronger contrast on the side that's bathed in light. So in order to accomplish that, this is going to be a little bit darker on this side. Also notice that I'm using pretty smooth strokes. I'm trying to keep my shading technique pretty smooth. I'd like for this to read as all one tone, evenly shaded in. And actually, I shouldn't say all one tone, just all smooth. But you can vary the tone. And as you see, I'm going to add a little deeper tone right there by the sphere to pop that sphere edge. And then notice how lightly I'm going to shade behind the cone, because the cone's in a darker edge, so I'm going to shade lighter around the cone. And then I'm going to deepen the shadow behind the cube, because I want the top of the cube to pop. That's light. But right behind the cone, it's needing to be a lighter shading there. On the surface of the table, it does catch more light, and so I'm going to shade the table, but shade it lighter than I would shade the backdrop. And so you see I'm going around to lightly shade the table, keeping my markings pretty even and light. And I do not want the markings to be darker than the shadow, so I'm making sure to bring my shadow edge, to deepen the shadow edge as I am shading the table, to make sure the shadow stays very clear here. And that's the goal here. And so I'm just going to take some time to finish shading this. So keep doing this along with me. And that is finished. The shading looks good. The tones, when I squint, it reads properly. But what I'd like to do at this point is I'm going to go back into the drawing to smooth the background. You don't have to do this. This is optional. I'm choosing to make this a blended finished piece. So I'm going to go ahead and finish it using the tissue to smoothen the backdrop. But a lot of artists will leave all of the texture of the lines as part of the beauty of the artwork, and that can be perfectly fine. So in this case, smoothing in on the surface was a real challenge. It was easy for those shadows to kind of start getting blended in with the table, so I had to be really thoughtful about how I was blending it in with the tissue. Um, on the form, when you're blending, you really want to not go from the dark to the light, because what will happen is the shading tone is going to change dramatically. And we already figured out where we want our tone to be. So I recommend that you don't use this technique from dark to light. You want to use it from light to dark. Here I'm going to use the blending stick to get even more detailed in my shading. Like I said to you, the blending stick for the beginner level is optional. What I like about it is it does just give you a little bit more control over how you're blending, but you can roll up the tissue paper and accomplish a similar look, if not the same look. You could also put the tissue paper around your pencil and use it like a blending stick that way, as long as you are aware of where the edge of the pencil is and making sure it's not poking through. That could work well too. But the goal here is just to smooth the whole drawing. So pay attention to what I'm doing here, and I'm just going to add the finishing touches on this. And that wraps up this still life shading lesson. I really hope this was helpful to you. If you're interested in more fine art instruction, be sure to subscribe to Rough and Artist. Thank you so much, and God bless.